Welcome, and thank you for joining us for Contemporary Art Taos 2020, the Artist Interview Series. The series consists of short interviews between myself and the artists and is released twice a month throughout the duration of the show. Joining us today is Afton Love, and her work in this show is 16 Faces in 16 Bowls, which is featured behind me. Thank you for being here, Afton.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course. So the work behind me is actually made of hand-dug micaceous clay, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means for those who might not know. Where did you dig this clay from?
So I live in northern New Mexico, kind of southwest of Taos, and I dug this clay just sort of 15 minutes from where I live, and it's been a process of learning all about clay. I wasn't a ceramicist before I learned to dig this clay. I was kind of trying to expand my process in certain ways that had ideas of what I wanted something to look like, and I felt like clay was going to be able to do that for me. And working with commercial clay was my only option for quite a while, and I was working with a ceramicist actually in Roswell because I was doing a residency down there for the year of 2018. And I was working with a ceramicist there to help me come up with a way to make what I was trying to make, and especially make the clay black. And she was sort of giving me different glazes and different ways of turning the surface black. But I think more what I was looking for was how to make the clay itself black, or the inside the same as the outside. And I found that through not just the micaceous clay, but also the process of firing in a pit, which basically is what the entire piece of 16 Faces and 16 Bowls. Each of those is somewhat unique. You can kind of see like smoke marks and fire marks and all of those elements that are sort of unique to every single piece comes from it being fired in a pit. But digging the clay before even getting to the firing part locally, and being part of the process of going to where the clay is dug, digging the clay, which just looks kind of like bare earth, and then going through the whole process of transforming that into a clay body was and has been extremely fulfilling and kind of integral to a lot of what I consider important in my work now.
Right, because you don't just go and grab clay from a riverbed and start using it to fire, right? There's an entire milling and purification. And can you tell us?
Yeah, it's so cool. I mean, yeah, like when you dig it out of the ground, I mean, there's something so special about the micaceous clay. Like the clay itself has mica flakes in it, and mica is found all over the world. Mica is, it's mined for industrial use for all kinds of reasons. And here in New Mexico, there's lots of old mica mines. None of them are in use anymore, as far as I know. But there's, through sort of like the 20s through the 60s, there was a lot of mica mining going on. But before that, obviously, for basically time immemorial, people who have lived on these lands have used the micaceous clay and incorporated it into their, fundamentally incorporated into their customs for a really, really long time. And so it's really, really neat to be part of that learning process of where the clay is, which is essentially everywhere. I mean, so much of the Earth's surface is clay. And there's specific pockets that people have used for a long time here in this region that have either smaller amounts of mica or more amounts of mica. There's all different, like muscovite and biotite are the two different kinds of mica that's found in this region. And so that means some of it is more of like a small sparkle that's in it. Other ones, it's like larger flakes. And I've sort of dug both and tried to use both in different ways. And it's neat to sort of figure out the difference between the two. But the process of digging is really neat. You feel like kind of like a kid. You like dig in the ground and it's just dirt. It doesn't look like anything that special initially. And then when you add water to it, and you sort of go through this sifting process of getting all of the natural material, like the organic material out of it, all the rocks and stones and most of the sand out of it. And then you just go through this like refining process. And as it dries without getting too dry, you suddenly have this moldable body. It's like alchemy. It's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, and the mica has this sort of iridescence. It's not over the top. It's this like lovely subtle shininess that you can see in all of your work. And like you mentioned, Taos Pueblos certainly have used it in their pottery.
Yeah, the Pueblos, it's interesting. I was researching that when I first started using the clay, because mica is found in so many places in the world. I mean, it's found all over the United States, mostly here in South Dakota. And it's all over, like China and Asia has so much mica, and that's where most of the industrial mining is now. But basically, the northern New Mexico Pueblos are and the people that were here before they were the Pueblos are the only ones historically that are documented as using it as clay. Wow. And I don't know why, but it's really specific to this region. It's really special in that way.
That's incredible. So you mentioned a little bit about pit firing. Can you take us through the whole process, including your somewhat unusual materials you include in these?
Sure, yeah. Oops. Can you see me?
Mm-hmm,
okay. Yeah, so that's another element that for me has become really special, really important. Like when I first learned to use this clay from a really dear friend of mine, Johnny Ortiz, who is from the Taos Pueblo, and his brother and him sort of separately and together relearned how to use their local clay. And it wasn't taught to them by their immediate ancestors, but they knew that it was in their shared culture. And so they both started using the clay. Brandon Ortiz a little bit more traditionally, Johnny a little less traditionally. And Johnny's process that he shared with me had a lot to do with the firing and what happens when you pay really close attention to what's happening in the pit, even though you can't necessarily see what's happening. You put your pieces in, and the work behind you right now, the 16 faces and 16 bowls, looks entirely black. But when the clay is raw, when it's dry and has not been fired yet, it's kind of basically like a bright orange color. It's this amazing sort of glittery orange color. And when you go through the entire process, if you put it in the pit and you let the flames take over, and then if you were to let the fire completely consume the work and then completely die out, which is sort of traditionally what Taos Pueblo does, you get ember marks where something leans against the work and then leaves a mark. And then you take the piece out, and almost all of it is sort of back to this like golden orange color. But if you stop the process somewhere in the middle there's this sweet spot where all the organic materials that are still inside the clay combust. And in that moment, there's also a time when all the smoke is sort of entering the clay and getting trapped in there in that time. And then after that, if you let the fire continue, or you let the piece continue to fire, when it gets a little bit hotter, all of that again will be released, and then you get a vitrified orange colored clay. But there's this sweet sort of incredible moment where all of that happens at once. The piece does become vitrified, and yet still all that organic material, all that carbon is caught in the clay, and it's black. And so what I do essentially is sort of like take all the pieces out as I sort of can see or feel or hope that moment is happening. And so it comes out at a very specific time when it's still black, before all of that gets re-released back into the fire or the atmosphere. And what you sort of hinted at before is that this work is a very it's an odd way to use the clay because it's very thin. If you see it, if you're up close to it, you'll notice like how delicate and thin the clay is. And that's just a process that I came up with, when I was being taught and when I was learning how to use this clay. I was learning, sort of traditional practice and how the clay has been used traditionally. And I have, as a fine artist, as a primarily two-dimensional artist, I have sort of a preternatural attraction to paper. I've always been a paper-based artist. And so as I continue to work with the clay and trying to come up with my own, basically like my personal use of the clay or my personal voice through the clay, ended up desiring to use it a little bit more like paper. And so I came up with this process where I add wool to the clay when it's in sort of the in-between stage between being something that's like a slurry and really wet, and before it dries and becomes like a thick clay body. I sort of stop the process in the middle and I add a lot of wool to the clay, and that makes it usable like paper mache, essentially. So my process is this thing where I can now, instead of sculpting, I do more of like a layering process, the way you would build out of paper mache. And so, it can take multiple layers before it dries, or as it's drying, you can add more and it won't crack. And that's like a big issue with me and clay, is the cracking process, because I want to be able to sort of like add as I'm going instead of building all at once. And so these pieces, it's sort of like this thin layering I do on either stone or on molds that I've made out of commercial clay that have been laid on stone, or on bowls. Like in this case, this is, a 16 faces and 16 bowls. And the bowls, I used a pookie that was made by Brandon Ortiz. And I was able to sort of use my clay solution as like almost using that bowl as a mold. And so as I'm building with the wool sort of clay concoction that I've come up with, it dries into something that's extremely durable, because the material inside strengthens the dried clay. And it's like the way you could see like a paper mache piece, if you got it wet again, it would fall apart. But as it is, it's very strong. But when these pieces get put into the fire, the wool is essentially burned out. So I don't list wool as part of my materials list in this work, because there's no wool left. But that is how I get the pieces to maintain their shape while being so thin, without a risk of cracking while they're drying. And that part of the process has become kind of, unique and special. And I mean, I think even conceptually, I've always liked to toe the line between things that are strong and delicate. Like something like this, like looks very strong because it has the black, and it's clay, and it's dense and hard, but in fact they're quite delicate. And in my larger drawings, I do drawings on tracing paper that have been dipped in beeswax, and those are transparent, and they have a very subtle element to them. They're hanging on the wall somewhat precariously, but because of the beeswax, are preserved in a way that makes them very strong. They look very delicate, but they're actually really hard to damage in that way. So I feel like these have a very nice play in that way of my sort of like trying to toe the line between strength and delicacy.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, we're a little bit far away in this video, but there are some really great photos on the Heartwood's Facebook page where you can see closer up some of the textures, and as Afton's mentioning, they're incredibly thin. They do almost look like paper, even though they're ceramics. Is the texture, because it's almost topographical. It looks, when I first saw it, I swore that you had somehow pressed the bottom of an arroyo and had in that texture. Is that from the subtractive process of the wool being taken out in the firing?
No, I love that you said that. So these pieces came from a work I was doing specifically with a rock that I was calling split rock, and it's a really large boulder in Abiquiu. And I first had, so I've done all this sort of, I did a large scale drawing of the piece, sort of like a portrait of that rock, and I wanted to preserve that rock in that way, like replicating it as best I could through my personal eye. And then I sort of like, as I continued to work with that rock and the image of that rock, and it has this like giant sort of split, like it's connected at its base, but at some point it was a whole boulder, and at some point it kind of just like cracked open, and I became like really obsessed with that sort of like space in between. And so what I did, both with my micaceous clay, my own clay, and commercial clay, I took slabs of clay and sort of pressed it into the interior of that crack. Mm. And that was just like, I don't know what, like almost some sort of ritual of like gathering information from inside a place that is kind of a mystery, that I'll never actually get the truth of when that happened, or how, or the time it took for it to happen, or all those things. But the replication of the actual contours of that space, I've sort of found by pressing. So most of these are made from pressing commercial clay into that rock, taking it off, and you get like it's an immediate sort of replication of all of the erosion and those beautiful lines that happen on sandstone just from sand and wind and time. And then firing those commercial pieces as molds. They're kind of like big tiles, or smaller and big tiles. And then using those tiles as molds, then I'm adding my clay in my process, sort of the paper mache type process, to those. So I can replicate that surface, but only the surface, not the density of the tile or the commercial clay that I've used. And so only the surface is sort of like replicated in these tiles. And then as they come off and they dry, then those go into the pit. And then those are sort of, they go through the full process. Oh, no.
You lost your video. There you go.
I know. Hold on 1 second. Sorry.
No problem.
I thought I wasn't going to have to plug this in, but I'm going to.
Of course. So you use a lot of terminology from epistemology when you describe your work. In particular, I hear you say a priori knowledge or a priori truth a lot. And just a quick definition, a priori knowledge is just truth that is independent from experience, like mathematics or deduction from reason, or tautologies is a good example. So from what I've read, you find that a priori knowledge or that a priori truth in geology. Can you speak about that?
Yeah. So I think, when we say a priori, I'm always looking for language to describe what we know, to describe something that almost everybody can agree on. Like we could say a priori knowledge could be described as 2 + 2 = 4. It's something that we can all agree on. We can sort of start a conversation from a certain place. But the beauty for me in a certain way about these terms or language about what we know or what we can know or we can all agree on is that the immediate sort of reflection of that is what we can't know and what we don't know and what we want to know. So I love this feeling, if I'm like, there's why geology, like why rocks, like why is this something that I'm invested in and thinking about? On some level, it's because it's obvious, it's on the surface. It's like, it's how the earth has produced life in a way that has gone way before humans arrived on the planet. They'll be here way after humans are gone. But it's also, they exist on a surface of the earth in a way that we do. Like humans, we're all just existing on the crust of this ball and we're an expression of life in that way. And we can only exist here on the surface from all these other elements that are happening, and the conditions are perfect for our life. And geology is also that. Like what we see is only on the surface of the earth. It's sort of like whatever's combusting and happening inside the interiority of the earth is something that is creating and has created life as we know it. And so, as mountains and rocks and, formations are being pushed up out of the earth all the time, they are an expression of what's going on deep within, kind of the way that we are. Like we as humans have come from all those forces as well, all the combustion, all the pressure, all of the elements of life that have been created just here on this planet. We're an expression of that. And it is easy for us to sort of be like tied to this idea of us as an expression of life because we have consciousness. But the thing about it is that, it's kind of nice to remember or to think about the fact that everything that we are encountering all day long, no matter what it is also an expression of life, just in a different way. And so when I'm talking about, when we get into epistemology and phenomenology, it has so much to do with like what we see, how we interpret time, and how we see ourselves in our time frame. We have a vision of what time is because we exist in our own timeline. And then there's so much else going on around us that's happening on a different timeline, but is essentially no less or more knowable, basically. And so when I'm thinking about, what it means to be human or what it means to live a meaningful life, so there's a desire to know, there's a desire to have a grasp and an understanding of everything that we can know. And as humans, we know so much, but a lot of what we know is based on math and science. And so we have a basic understanding of our limits of knowledge. And I find that like so poetic and fascinating. Like we know about the center of the earth. We know what's happening down there. There's books and books and books about the core of the earth. And yet it's below the surface. It's below the surface of our knowledge in a way that we don't ever get to experience it. So I think there's an interesting connection between what we know and what we can experience. And for me, geology has a really beautiful marriage of the two, because we can walk up and touch it. And it feels like, if I'm touching the surface of a rock and wondering how long it's been that way or how long it's going to be that way, it's not that different from me going up and sort of touching your face, and yet it has, it bears some kind of connection to the mysteries that are sort of under the Earth's surface that are defined for us, but not experienced.
I love this concept of bringing us back into that geological time. And I think not only your material, clay being related to geology, but also your scale you work on sort of positions us back in there too. You're always working on this quite large scale clay work, but also the drawings and your photos that you look up. So we only have time for one more question.
Okay.
I'm asking this question to all the artists. This exhibition was limited to artists in Taos or with deep roots in Taos. Can you tell us about your relationship to the Taos community?
Sure. Let's see. Okay, so I, as a kid, I came to New Mexico quite a lot. I'm from California. My mom was born in Santa Fe. I So came and visited, you know, cousins and aunts and uncles that were here, mostly around the Santa Fe area. And so I had a connection to the state of New Mexico, but didn't come back until I was, you know, I think it was 2015. 2015, I did a residency in Taos at the Wurlitzer Foundation. And it's hard to describe. I feel like as soon as I got to Taos, and I've been to New Mexico so many times in so many different places around, and even, you know, obviously, like I said, Santa Fe, but when I got to Taos, I felt like I was existing on some kind of like out of body experience or something. I was not touching the ground, and I had like this feeling of just like deep falling in love, I guess you could say. And I felt like this well of inspiration sort of open to me in a way that I haven't had before. And I mean, I feel it now. You know, I don't even live in Taos right now. I live outside of Taos, but like I feel it all over this area, and it feels like it's connected, of course, to geology. Like this is geologically an incredible place, and like that type of inspiration is everywhere. But it's also an energetic one. I can't totally describe what that is, but as long as that well, like it's really deep and kind of forever giving to me right now. And I've felt it for, you know, basically for 5 years. And as long as I still feel that, like this will always be home to me. I'm so grateful to it. And it's been sort of it's almost like the most profound relationship I've had in my life is finding that connection and that sort of like gift. I don't know how else to describe it. It's a little bit out there, but
it's perfect. I think people can feel that way for a really long time, actually.
Yeah.
Sorry. So thank you so much, Afton, for joining us and for sharing. And thank you all for joining us on Facebook Live. Join us next time, next Wednesday on November 18th with Nina Silverberg.
Nice.